The quarterly merger proposal spread across my desk required the kind of complex financial analysis that had made me the youngest partner in Morrison & Associates' 90-year history. Numbers that would reshape 2 Fortune 500 companies, employment for thousands of workers, and investment returns that could fund entire pension systems. Just another Tuesday morning in corporate law, where billion-dollar decisions were made between coffee refills. My assistant knocked on the office door, interrupting my review of the antitrust implications outlined in Section 47. "Ms. Reynolds, your mother-in-law called. She wants to discuss the anniversary party arrangements." I set down my red pen and checked the time. Helen Parker Montgomery had been calling daily for 3 weeks about our 5th wedding anniversary celebration, micromanaging everything from the floral arrangements to the guest list. Most of her suggestions involved demonstrating why her son David had married beneath his social station. Did she mention anything specific? Something about upgrading the wine selection. She said the vintage you chose might not meet the expectations of the Montgomery family's social circle. The Montgomery family's social circle. A collection of old money families who measured success by how many generations their wealth had survived, rather than how much value they created. David's family had built their fortune in railroad investments during the 1920s and had been coasting on inherited prestige ever since. My intercom buzzed. "Also, your husband called. He'll be working late again tonight. The Harrison Industries audit is taking longer than expected." David had been working extended hours for 3 months, ever since his accounting firm landed the massive audit contract. Helen blamed me for his demanding schedule, suggesting that a proper wife would ensure her husband prioritized family obligations over career advancement. The irony was rich. Helen spent her days organizing charity lunches and country club committees, while I managed legal strategies that affected international markets. But in her worldview, my career was a distraction from my real purpose of supporting David's success and producing Montgomery grandchildren. I returned to the merger documents, analyzing regulatory compliance requirements and potential shareholder conflicts. This deal would be featured in every major business publication, setting precedents for corporate restructuring that would influence similar transactions for years. The kind of work that required expertise Helen would never understand or appreciate. By 6 that evening, I was reviewing final contract revisions when David finally arrived home. Our house in Beacon Hill was elegant but understated, the kind of property that conveyed success without ostentation. Helen had criticized our choice, preferring something more traditional that would reflect the Montgomery family's established taste. "How was your day?" David asked, loosening his tie as he collapsed into the leather chair across from my desk. "Productive. We finalized the Morrison-Hartford merger terms. The closing should happen next month." David's eyes lit up. He might not fully understand the technical aspects of my work, but he appreciated its significance. "That's huge, Victoria. Congratulations." "Thank you. How's the Harrison audit progressing?" "Slowly. There are some irregularities in their subsidiary accounting that need careful review. I'll probably be working weekends for the next month." I could already hear Helen's reaction to that news. More complaints about David's demanding schedule, more subtle suggestions that I should convince him to prioritize family time over professional obligations. "Speaking of family time," David continued, "Mother called about the anniversary party. She has some additional thoughts about the arrangements." "Such as?" "She thinks we should serve champagne instead of wine during the toasts. Something about the symbolic importance of celebrating milestone marriages appropriately." Helen's symbolic improvements always seemed to involve more expensive choices that would demonstrate proper Montgomery family standards. champagne instead of wine, orchids instead of roses, musicians instead of a playlist. Whatever makes her happy, I said, though we both knew nothing would make Helen completely happy. My existence in David's life was a constant reminder that he'd chosen love over strategic marriage within their social circle. Victoria, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret not having a traditional wedding? Mother mentioned that some of her friends still talk about how quickly we got married, how simple the ceremony was. I looked at my husband, really looked at him. David was genuinely kind, supportive of my career, and completely oblivious to his mother's systematic campaign to undermine our marriage. He had no idea that Helen regularly suggested he'd settle for someone beneath his station. I regret nothing about our wedding, I said firmly. We married for the right reasons, and that's what matters. What David didn't know was that I'd insisted on a prenuptial agreement before we married. Not because I doubted our relationship, but because I understood exactly what kind of family I was marrying into. Helen's initial reaction to our engagement had made it clear that she viewed me as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent family member. The prenup negotiations had been handled by my personal attorney, separate from David's family lawyers. Helen didn't know it existed, probably assuming that David would never consider such an arrangement with someone from my modest background. She was wrong about many things, but especially about the balance of power in our marriage. The anniversary party was scheduled for Saturday evening in our home's garden. Helen had convinced David that a public venue would be too impersonal for such an important milestone, though I suspected she preferred the control that hosting at our house would give her. By Thursday, the preparations were in full swing. Helen arrived early that morning with her interior designer, rearranging furniture and replacing my carefully chosen flower arrangements with more elaborate alternatives. "Victoria, darling," she said, examining my dress selection hanging in the bedroom closet. "Don't you think something more formal would be appropriate? This is a Montgomery family celebration, after all. A Montgomery family celebration. As if David and I were incidental guests at our own anniversary party. I think the dress I chose is perfectly appropriate, Helen. Of course, dear. I just want everything to reflect well on David. You understand." I understood exactly what she meant. Helen wanted everything to demonstrate that David had maintained family standards despite his unfortunate choice in wives. "The Vanderbilts will be attending," Helen continued, "along with the Ashfords and the Whitman family. They're all very traditional about these matters." Traditional about these matters meant they were all very judgmental about David's marriage to someone whose father was a public school teacher rather than a trust fund manager. "I'm sure they'll find the celebration adequate," I replied. Helen's smile tightened. Adequate wasn't the impression she wanted to make on her social circle. She'd spent weeks planning an event that would prove David's marriage hadn't diminished his family's standing. Friday evening brought the final preparations. Catering staff arranged tables in the garden, while Helen supervised every detail with the intensity of a military commander. She transformed our intimate outdoor space into something resembling a country club formal event. "The flowers are perfect," she declared to the florist. "Exactly the level of elegance the Montgomery name requires." David appeared beside me as we watched his mother orchestrate the preparations. "She's really outdone herself this time. She certainly has strong opinions about how our anniversary should be celebrated. Mother just wants everything to be special for us." I didn't respond. Helen wanted everything to be special for David, with minimal consideration for my preferences or comfort. But David couldn't see the distinction because he'd grown up assuming that his happiness was everyone's primary concern. Saturday arrived with perfect weather and Helen's complete satisfaction with the arrangements. By 7 that evening, guests were arriving in expensive cars and designer clothing, exactly the audience Helen had curated to witness Montgomery family success. I greeted guests in the cocktail dress I'd originally selected, despite Helen's disapproving glances. Conversations flowed around topics like vacation homes in the Hamptons, children's private school placements, and investment strategies for preserving generational wealth. Victoria called Margaret Ashford, approaching with her husband Charles. "What a lovely celebration. You and David look so happy together." Margaret had always been polite to me, though her tone suggested surprise that David's unconventional marriage had lasted 5 years. Charles nodded approvingly while scanning the party arrangements with the eye of someone evaluating social status. "Thank you, Margaret. We're grateful to have friends like you celebrating with us." 5 years, Charles mused. Time really does fly. And you're both doing so well professionally. He said it with genuine warmth, but I noticed Helen approaching from across the garden with the purposeful stride that usually preceded her most pointed observations. "Charles, Margaret," Helen said, joining our conversation circle. "I'm so glad you could be here to celebrate David's anniversary. He's accomplished so much professionally, and it's wonderful to see him building on the Montgomery family legacy." David's anniversary, as if I were merely an observer rather than an equal participant in our marriage. "David has certainly established himself as one of the city's premier accountants," Margaret replied diplomatically. "The Harrison Industries audit is a tremendous opportunity," Helen continued. "Exactly the kind of high-profile work that establishes reputations in our social circle." Our social circle. Helen's careful language always excluded me from family achievements while including me in any potential embarrassments. More guests gathered as Helen warmed to her favorite topic, David's success and promising future. She discussed his career trajectory, his investment strategies, and his continued commitment to Montgomery family values. "Of course," she said, her voice carrying across the garden, "maintaining family standards becomes more challenging when marriages cross social boundaries. Some adjustments require more patience than others." The conversation around us quieted. Helen had perfected the art of delivering insults disguised as general observations, making it difficult to respond without appearing defensive. "Helen," I said calmly, "could you be more specific about which adjustments you're referring to?" She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully maneuvered their opponent into an uncomfortable position. "Oh, nothing critical, dear. Just the natural learning curve that comes with adapting to established family expectations." David appeared at my side, sensing tension, but not understanding its source. "Mother, are you talking about work schedules again? Victoria and I have everything balanced perfectly." "I'm talking about broader compatibility issues, David. Some people naturally understand what's expected in families like ours, while others require more guidance." The circle of guests exchanged glances. Helen's meaning was transparent to everyone except David, who still believed his mother's criticisms were motivated by concern rather than prejudice. "What kind of guidance?" I asked, maintaining my professional composure despite the public nature of Helen's attack. "Well," Helen said, glancing around to ensure she had an adequate audience, "I think it's obvious that David deserves someone who truly complements his background and aspirations. Someone from a family that understands the responsibilities that come with the Montgomery name." The garden fell quieter as nearby conversations stopped. Helen had crossed from subtle disapproval into direct insult, publicly questioning my worthiness as David's wife at our own anniversary celebration. "Helen," David started, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish, darling. I've watched this marriage for 5 years, hoping that time would bridge the gap between your wife's background and our family's standards. But some differences are simply too fundamental to overcome. She turned to address me directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone delivering a final verdict. You're not good enough for my son. He deserves someone from a better family, someone who can truly appreciate what the Montgomery name represents. The silence that followed was complete. 30 guests stood frozen in our garden, witnessing Helen's public declaration that I was unworthy of my own marriage. David's face had gone white with shock and embarrassment. "Mother," he whispered, "you can't say things like that." "I can say what everyone here is thinking," Helen replied. "David, you're a Montgomery. You could have married anyone. Instead, you chose someone who will never truly fit into our world, no matter how hard she tries." I looked around at the faces of our guests. Some appeared embarrassed by Helen's cruelty. Others seemed curious about how I would respond to such a direct attack. All were waiting to see whether I would crumble under the public humiliation. Instead, I smiled calmly and walked toward our house. "Victoria, where are you going?" David called after me. "To get something from the office," I replied. "I'll be right back." I climbed the stairs to our home office where I kept important documents in a fireproof safe behind David's desk. Legal contracts, insurance policies, investment records, and the prenuptial agreement that Helen didn't know existed. The document was exactly where I'd filed it 5 years ago, in a folder marked Marriage Documents, Private. 27 pages of legal language that David's family attorney had helped draft, though he'd been sworn to confidentiality about its contents. I returned to the garden where guests were standing in uncomfortable silence while Helen basked in the satisfaction of having finally said what she'd been thinking for 5 years. "Helen," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the garden, "since you're concerned about David's future and family compatibility, I thought you might be interested in seeing this." I held up the prenuptial agreement for everyone to see. The legal document was bound in official blue covers with ribbons and seals that made its importance unmistakable. "What is that?" Helen asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand that her moment of triumph might be premature. "This is the prenuptial agreement David and I signed before our wedding," I announced to the stunned guests. "The document that outlines exactly how our marriage protects the Montgomery family interests you're so concerned about." Helen's confident expression faltered. "David didn't sign a prenuptial agreement. Actually, he did. At my insistence, not his." I opened the document to the section I'd memorized years ago. Section 12, subsection A. In the event of divorce initiated by either party, David Montgomery Parker retains sole ownership of all inherited family assets, including trust funds, real estate, and investment portfolios established prior to marriage. The guests were listening intently now, realizing they were witnessing something far more dramatic than a simple family argument. Section 12, subsection B, I continued, establishes that Victoria Reynolds Parker waives all claims to Montgomery family wealth, property, or business interests acquired through marriage. Helen was staring at the document like it might be fake. "That's impossible. David would never." Section 15. I interrupted, turning to the inheritance provisions, specifically addresses family legacy protection. "Would you like me to read that section aloud?" David stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "Victoria, what are you doing?" "I'm addressing your mother's concerns about family compatibility and financial security," I replied. Section 15, Inheritance Clause. Upon the death of David Montgomery Parker, His wife Victoria Reynolds Parker inherits the entirety of his estate, including all Montgomery family trusts, properties, and investment accounts, with full discretionary authority over distribution to surviving family members. The silence that followed was absolute. Helen's face went through several expressions as the implications of what she just heard became clear. "What does that mean?" whispered Margaret Ashford. I smiled at Helen, whose triumphant expression had completely disappeared. "It means that if something happens to David, I inherit everything. The family fortune, the trust funds, the real estate portfolio, all of it. And I have complete authority to decide what, if anything, David's family members receive." Helen grabbed the document from my hands, scanning the legal language frantically. "This can't be legal. It's completely legal. Drafted by Montgomery family attorneys and executed according to Massachusetts state law. David signed it willingly after extensive consultation with his legal counsel." David was reading over his mother's shoulder, his own eyes widening as he remembered the document he'd signed 5 years ago. "Victoria, I never realized the inheritance clause was so comprehensive," I finished. "Your attorney explained that it was the standard protection for marriages involving significant family wealth." Helen was still staring at the document, her face pale with shock. "But this means that if your son dies before me, his family fortune becomes my family fortune," I said clearly. "Every investment, every trust fund, every piece of property that's been in the Montgomery family for generations would legally belong to the woman you just declared isn't good enough for your son." The guests were looking back and forth between Helen and me like spectators at a tennis match. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 5 years had just been completely reversed. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling out another section of the prenup, Section 23 establishes that any family member who contests the inheritance provisions or attempts to interfere with the marriage forfeits any discretionary bequests I might choose to make." Helen's hands were shaking as she held the document. "David, tell me you understand what this means." David nodded slowly. "It means Victoria protected both of us. If we divorce, she gets nothing from the family money. But if I die first, she inherits everything and decides what happens to it, including," I added conversationally, "whether surviving family members receive anything at all." Helen sank into the nearest chair, the weight of her miscalculation becoming clear. For 5 years, she treated me like an unwelcome intruder who could be intimidated into leaving. She'd never imagined that I might be the person who would ultimately control the family fortune she was so desperate to protect. "Helen," I said gently, "you've spent 5 years telling me I'm not good enough for David, not worthy of the Montgomery name, not capable of understanding your family's standards. You've made it clear that you view me as a temporary inconvenience who will eventually be replaced by someone more suitable." I paused, letting her absorb the full implications of the legal document she was holding. "Unfortunately for you, David and I are very happily married. We have no intention of divorcing, which means that someday, probably many years from now, I will become the sole controller of every asset you spent your life trying to preserve for Montgomery family members." The garden was completely silent except for the sound of Helen's rapid breathing. "So," I continued, "I suggest you reconsider your approach to our relationship. Because the woman you just declared isn't good enough for your son is the woman who will ultimately decide whether you spend your retirement in comfort or poverty." Charles Ashford cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should give the family some privacy to discuss this." "Actually," I said, "I think we're finished discussing it. Helen now understands the legal realities of our marriage. There's nothing left to explain. David moved to stand beside me, his arm around my waist in a gesture of support. Mother, I think you owe Victoria an apology. Helen looked up from the prenuptial agreement, her face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning respect. Victoria, I had no idea. You had no idea that the woman you've been condescending to for 5 years is actually the person who will inherit your family's entire fortune, I asked. Or you had no idea that treating your son's wife with disrespect might have consequences. Both, Helen whispered. I walked over to where she sat and gently took the prenuptial agreement from her hands. Helen, I've never wanted your family's money. I make an excellent living in my own career. But David insisted on the inheritance clause because he wanted to ensure that his wife would be financially secure regardless of what happened to him. She nodded, still processing the reversal of everything she believed about our marriage. What I do want, I continued, is basic respect. Not because I'll inherit your family fortune, but because I'm a successful professional who loves your son and has been a faithful member of this family for 5 years. You're right, Helen said quietly. I've been unfair to you. You've been cruel, I corrected. You've spent 5 years trying to make me feel unwelcome in my own marriage. You've criticized my background, questioned my worthiness, and suggested that David should have married someone else. Helen's eyes filled with tears. I thought I was protecting him. From what? From a Harvard Law graduate who helps major corporations navigate complex legal challenges. From someone who insisted on a prenuptial agreement to protect his family's interests. From a wife who supports his career and makes him genuinely happy. David squeezed my hand. Victoria, she understands now. Does she? I asked, looking directly at Helen. Because I need to know that this behavior stops immediately. No more subtle insults. No more suggestions that I'm not worthy of the Montgomery name. No more treating me like a temporary inconvenience. Helen wiped her eyes and stood up slowly. Victoria, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect, and I owe David an apology for trying to undermine his marriage. She turned to address the guests who were still standing in awkward silence. I was wrong about Victoria. Completely wrong. She's been a wonderful wife to David and a more generous family member than I deserved. Margaret Ashford approached with a small smile. Victoria, I have to admit, that was the most impressive legal maneuvering I've ever witnessed at a social gathering. Charles nodded approvingly. Beautifully handled. You turned what could have been a devastating public humiliation into a demonstration of strength and preparation. Other guests began approaching to offer their congratulations on our anniversary and their admiration for how I'd handled Helen's attack. The evening that had started as Helen's public declaration of my unworthiness had become a celebration of my tactical brilliance. David pulled me aside while guests resumed their conversations. Victoria, I had no idea Mother had been so terrible to you. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was handling it, I replied, and because you love your mother despite her flaws. I didn't want to force you to choose between us. You'll never have to worry about that again, he said firmly. What she said tonight was unforgivable. It was illuminating, I corrected. Now she understands exactly what she has to lose if she continues treating me poorly. As the evening wound down and guests departed, Helen approached me one final time. Victoria, may I speak with you privately? We walked to a quiet corner of the garden where the catering staff was beginning to clean up the remnants of what would undoubtedly become legendary gossip in the Montgomery family social circle. I need you to understand something, Helen said. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was trying to protect David from what I thought was a mistake. Based on what evidence? My educational background? My professional success? My treatment of your son? Based on fear, she admitted. Fear that David was throwing away advantages I'd spent my life preserving for him. I studied her carefully. For the first time since I'd known her, Helen looked genuinely vulnerable rather than calculating. Helen, the advantages you're trying to preserve aren't worth anything if they require David to marry someone he doesn't love. I understand that now. Do you? Because this isn't just about inheritance documents or legal technicalities. This is about whether you can accept that David chose me for reasons that have nothing to do with social status or family connections. Helen was quiet for a long moment. He chose well, she said finally. Better than I gave him credit for. He chose for love, I replied. The same way he chooses to maintain a relationship with a mother who spent 5 years trying to sabotage his marriage. She flinched at the accuracy of my assessment. What can I do to make this right? Start by treating me like David's wife, instead of like someone who's temporarily borrowing your son. And the prenuptial agreement? I smiled. The prenuptial agreement protects everyone's interests, including yours. As long as you treat me with respect, you have nothing to worry about. 6 months later, Helen and I had developed what could almost be called a friendship. She still hosted elaborate social events and maintained her position in the city's high society circles, but she no longer treated me like an unwelcome outsider. Instead, she began introducing me as her brilliant daughter-in-law who'd graduated from Harvard Law and specialized in corporate mergers. She talked about my professional accomplishments with the same pride she'd previously reserved for David's career achievements. The change wasn't just social politeness. Helen had genuinely begun to appreciate that her son's happiness mattered more than social conventions. She'd also realized that having a successful attorney as a daughter-in-law provided certain advantages in her social circle. David and I celebrated our 6th anniversary with a small dinner party that Helen organized according to my preferences rather than her own. The guest list included people David and I actually enjoyed spending time with, rather than just impressive names from the social register. During the toasts, Helen stood up to address the guests. 5 years ago, I thought David was making a mistake by marrying outside our immediate social circle. I was wrong about everything except David's judgment. Victoria has been the best thing that ever happened to our family. She raised her glass toward me. To the woman who was smart enough to protect everyone's interests, strong enough to stand up to family interference, and patient enough to give a stubborn mother-in-law time to recognize her value. As guests applauded, I reflected on the long journey from Helen's hostility to her genuine acceptance. The prenuptial agreement that she discovered at our anniversary party had been my insurance policy, but respect had been earned through years of professional success and personal integrity. Sometimes the most satisfying victory isn't destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's forcing them to acknowledge that they were wrong about who you are and what you're worth. Helen had spent 5 years trying to make me feel inferior. In the end, she learned that the woman she dismissed was actually the person who held her family's future in her hands. The legal documents were just paperwork. The real power had always been in refusing to accept Helen's assessment of my worth, maintaining my professional excellence, and proving through actions, rather than arguments, that David had chosen wisely. 7 years later, when Helen's friends ask about her daughter-in-law, she tells them I'm the most accomplished attorney in the city and the perfect wife for her son. She's learned that family strength comes from supporting each other's success rather than competing for social status. And the prenuptial agreement? It remains filed safely in our home office protecting everyone's interests while serving as a reminder that the most effective defense against prejudice is preparation, patience, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth.